Warm greetings and good evening. Welcome to this evening talk from King Regina Space. I hope that you can hear well, and would like to welcome those who are with us on Zoom. If you're happy to come into camera, and if you like, interact in the chat. And this topic today, addressing ego in psychology. And we will be looking at this in a way, is there something that we can discover that at the moment we have a lot of research in psychology, but what is happening in the news today, 1 in 6 adults experiencing moderate to severe depression symptoms in the UK for the many reasons we all know. And so we're having more insights into the technical side and into medical side, but the things we are doing maybe need more light of understanding, because it is not necessarily reaching the community. And I would like to bring in this point Konstantina, and she's a chartered counselling psychologist, originally from Greece, has been a student of Raj Yoga for the last 3 years with the Brahma Kumaris, currently based in Bristol. And we're going to be in discussion. I myself have been experimenting and experiencing the benefits of Raj Yoga meditation for just over a decade. So we're really looking forward to this chance to investigate further this subject and shine light on what is the way to address, maybe from a spiritual view. So I'm going to welcome Konstantina to perhaps give us a bit of an overview of the subject.
Okay. Hi, Sarah. Yes, it's an interesting topic, and I think one that a bit overlooked in psychology. So I think it's always useful to bring the spiritual dimension in our understanding of what's going on, and it is a perspective that is completely being ignored, not only in the field of psychology, but also in education. We don't actually talk very often about spirituality, and fortunately, we don't always try to understand some of in this case, psychological difficulties or human suffering, if you want to use a more generic term, by using spirituality. Mm-hmm.
It'd be nice to understand, why is it that you feel we need spirituality, and what is it you understand from spirituality about the ego?
Yeah, it might be helpful at this point, I suppose, to differentiate what we all try to give a definition of ego within the context of spirituality that might be quite different to what people understand in more kind of conventional psychology. So ego was first mentioned by Freud, and it's the conscious part of personality, is the only conscious part of the personality. So human psyche, if you like, or personality consists of different parts, and ego is the conscious one, and the one who makes decision, if you like, and try to balance between the other two, the id, which is the more primitive ones, and the superego, which is the perfect self. So ego, according to psychology, it's the part that actually is aware of what we think, the conscious part. In spirituality, ego is very, very different. We refer, it's the result, if you like, of what happens when we ignore the spiritual dimension of the self. And as a result of that, we try to find ourselves in the physical dimension. So it's a false identification, if you like, happens when we try to get a sense of who we are and a sense of self-worth based on things in the physical, whether that very obvious things such as where we come from, our gender, our physical build, but other things such as our knowledge, our possession, our relationships, our titles. So, and within spirituality, these are false identities because they are not actually represent the reality of who we really are. So they come with lots of problems. And
yeah, that's helpful. I think because the root word will just mean I am, but in this case, we're using it to give a definition to the false understanding of the self. So in a way, the very true sense is like different. We are using a different word for that, but here you use the word false identification. So that is what we are using ego for in this spiritual model. So then that we're all on the same page. So yeah, that's helpful. So it's when we are basing our sense of self on something temporary that, and so would you like to maybe give us an orientation from your experience, your study about the real I, so we can get like a orientation?
Yeah, so the real it's a quite big subject, but I think an easy way to approach it is to reflect a little bit to the way that we refer to ourselves when we try to understand who we are. And there are two parts in the way that we refer to ourselves. There's a human being. So in addition to being human, in addition to the visible, if you like, part of who we are, that we understand as this body, and maybe anything that happens around this body in this physical world or our interactions. There is the other part, which is the being. So, in that sense, there is a recognition when we acknowledge that part, there is a recognition that there is something higher and there's more to life than meets the eyes, if you like. So in this model, the Raj yoga model, the true self, it's if you like an invisible presence or a consciousness. We call it we refer to it as the soul, and we see it in the image of tiny point of light, and this point of light, the true self, if you like, it operates in this physical world, in this dimension, but actually doesn't belong to this dimension and doesn't come from this dimension. It comes from a place which is equally invisible and changeless, if you like, and timeless. And from its perspective, this physical dimension, it's almost like a story or a drama. So this tiny, if you like, point of light comes to this drama as a guest, as a traveler, plays its role, but when the story comes to an end, it leaves everything on stage and returns back home. So the big emphasis here is to understand this part, this being, the true self, as something that is beyond the limitations of the physical. So it doesn't end when the physical ends. And because it holds, if you like, this awareness, brings this security, if you like, feels so secure. It's the soul, the true self is the one that can experience love, the one that can experience peace and happiness. because this awareness brings that sense of security. So that's what we understand as the true self.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we'll probably come back to that, but just it gives a nice map, because we associate ego usually actually with a sort of an arrogance or a puffed up sense of the self. We don't normally associate it with low self-respect, low self-esteem. But what's interesting here is that there are two sides of the same coin, that is the ego. And then you mentioned the true self is the one that has the capacity to feel secure for the reasons you mentioned, this aspect of guest. Would be nice if you want to share, or we can just to clarify, do we need ego? I mean, before we go on to understand perhaps the difficulties that you'd like to maybe talk about, there are some schools of thought that say we need it to survive or to protect ourselves. So do you want to say anything about that?
I wonder whether you would like, I think we were talking about this lovely example of a sister who has two brothers. So I don't know whether you would like maybe to comment on that, and then I can add on it.
Yeah, well, yes, it's the question I've heard answered. It's very simple that I understood it. If someone has two brothers and the sister loves both the brothers equally, one may become the president, and it's a great status. And after a while, you might, if you're the sister, see yourself as the sister of the president. So that becomes a reflected glory. The other brother might be something more humble, like gardener at the college, but there is love for both. But in time, this indulgence of the ego, the identification of being the sister of the president, you might start to even introduce yourself or have this self-image. But that was not needed to have the loving relationship and connection and interaction. And that also is vulnerable, because that president can get defamed or the position finishes, and there will be a feeling of loss or suffering connected with that. And it's a totally different department, if you like, from the relationship. So there are other examples, but if anyone has a question on that, feel free to pop it in the chat. But here we, as you mentioned, it's a false identification. So in that, we don't need falsehood. In fact, the more clear we are, the more loving we can be. So yes. So if you have anything you'd like to build on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely example that illustrates how unnecessary, not only unnecessary ego is, but how problematic it can become in the future if we don't pay attention to it. Because as you were saying, and we're going to explore that as the conversation's going on, when we develop an ego identity based on something external, in this example that you just mentioned, the sister develops an ego of being, if you like, an ego identity based on being the sister of a professor. It actually, if you like, let's say, contaminate the feeling of love, because if you're not careful and you carry over with this ego identity, where actually the love was already there anyway. When ego identities are removed, because actually we kind of build a sense of well-being, if you like, on them, it's extremely painful. So I think it's a good example that illustrates that we don't actually need ego, and the complications that can add to relationships.
Yeah, and nice to have this theme of, as you mentioned in our earlier discussion, it is having this direct impact on the quality of relationships. And the ego is selfish in that way because it is insecure. So would you like to maybe go into this understanding that you have had as an orientation of ego, and to help understand this being a root to the psychological difficulties and suffering? So maybe it'd be interesting to see how that throws light on the problem.
And I suppose following from what we are saying, we can see that one of the problem with ego identities and false identification is that they are based on things that they're that they're external, they belong in the physical, so they're very unpredictable, and they are likely to change or to end. So this false identification, if you like, in nature, they are very vulnerable and very insecure. There's always that sense that anything can go at any time. And it's a very, there are two issues, I suppose, here. It's not only, first of all, it's a very limited way of understanding ourselves, because it's almost like we see ourselves as somebody that's born with nothing and then becomes something as we go along in life, and we accumulate, if you like, possessions or relationships or titles. But then within that limited perspective of the self, only as a human, when that ends, everything goes. So that automatically is the end of the self. And that makes this physical world and life an extremely frightening and scary place to be. So these eco identities are always, if you like, you always feel threatened and live in fear. So what that means then is that they constantly, because it feels empty, ego, it constantly pursues things. It constantly has desires. So, and that creates an attitude of what we call sometimes of a beggar. So I can never get, not only, I'm constantly pursuing things, but even when I get them, I never felt satisfied. So that also gives me the attitude of the victim. So it's a very unpleasant, to say the least, place to be. And because the ego always lacking, there's always that sense that I'm lacking something, and I constantly, have desires. What that means is that I'm constantly if we think about lots of psychological problems, I constantly stressed because I'm constantly wondering, will I be able to achieve the things that I think that will make me happy in life? But also I worry a lot. Worry is a lot to do with the future and what will happen to me. So when I feel so insecure, the future, not only the present, but also the future appears very frightening. So I will feel quite anxious. I will worry a lot. It will affect my relationship with other people, because if others get what I want and I don't, maybe that creates some jealousy or envy. Or am I actually, if I feel that I'm responsible for not getting what I need in life, I might start feeling very guilty and very depressed. So quite a lot of the problems that we see people having stems actually from the foundation, if you like, of it is misconception, if you like, of who we are, and our unwillingness, or I don't know, there might be some ignorance there as well, to incorporate in our understanding that in addition to the human part, there is also the being part. And I think that's the price we pay, that we lead a life of misery and a life of unhappiness.
It's quite a picture. And what is helpful in a way, you're kind of in a way diagnosis, so it implies that there is another place to be that isn't constantly feeling it's a bit like the ground underneath is not firm. I remember a friend saying it's a bit like sitting on cracks. You know, if your house is built, it appears okay, but there are cracks. It's like you want to forget about it, and that it's like hard to face. It's something needs addressing at the foundation. And I think that can explain why we go into distraction, or ordinarily into addiction, being busy. But this being able to see why it's happening already, there's a little bit of freedom, isn't there, to be able to say that in a way helplessly. There is insecurity, of course, understandable if this is the premise. Would you like to say a little bit, or I don't know if you'd like to complete on that or move to how we come out of these syndromes? You mentioned beggar and potential victim.
One thing I suppose it might be helpful to reflect on is what we see ego doing on an individual level. You know, lots of the problems that we talk about, depression, you know, there's that sense that constantly people feel that they haven't made it. We see that a lot, I suppose, in therapy rooms, where people, no matter how much they've got, it constantly feels that they haven't achieved enough. So in terms, you know, and in addition, I suppose, to what it does on an individual level, it also affects things on a collective level. So if we see a little bit more about what's going on around the world at the moment, we, you know, any violence, from a minor instance of violence to what we see, you know, wars taking place, we can understand how the role that ego even plays in that, where there's that sense of greediness, if you like, or I'm out there to take rather than give. And also ego see others as different and see others as superior or inferior. So quite a lot of our collective, if you like, of what happens in the collective, quite a lot of the problems stems from ego. And the need to be right, and the need to make others wrong, or that sense of feeling threatened. You know, we see quite a lot of that based on fear, how a whole kind of country can have taken itself to war. So it's, or I suppose even more, you know, our attitude to the environment, it's very ego-driven as well, where we don't see the long-term implications of what we are doing, but all that is interesting if we are what we can get now, and how we can benefit ourselves. So when we're thinking about ego, I suppose it's good to have this more generic, I suppose, perspective of the impact that it has.
What might make it challenging is, I mean, you mentioned the consequences when it has been created, because it's something insecure and based on something temporary, but it doesn't feel like that at the beginning. It feels maybe good, you know, to whatever that first step is. So I think that's where we need perhaps more orientation if we want to move on this path. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, because you mentioned suffering, but it might be not seen like that. It's like what is ordinarily seen as good is accumulation, bigger status. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that when the ego gets developed, it appears that's the goal, is to have more status, more attention.
Mm-hmm. But this is not obviously where true happiness and peace of mind lies, because you are in the stepping in the wrong direction. So what it might feel on a surface level as a success is actually you digging further and further down into misery. And an example that comes to mind, I suppose, where you can see what ego can do. We see that in people that actually obtain lots of fame in their lives and become very famous. And, you know, we see how one can have everything they want, and that huge, deep misery and unhappiness. I mean, there's so much a strong connection in the world of fame and addictions, and that's not random. Because actually what happens, it's such I suppose obvious then that none of that can give you what you're looking for, but there's nowhere to go because you've reached the level of that, you know, trying to accumulate and achieve. So when people have a breakdown, you know, it's a breaking point, and that's what happens when you are leading life without that sense of who you are in a deeper sense. Sooner or later, I think you find yourself there.
So quote that food for the ego is poison for the soul. It was Donna Goddard. And so it is like the more we go for that happiness, the more we are distanced from our innate happiness, and it also leads us in the wrong direction. It's like we think just a bit more, but very profound when we see those who have got a certain amount. If that's their basis, it cannot sustain.
Yeah, and that's another way of understanding actually what happens to the soul, if you like, when these ego identities take over. And it's almost like we create layers upon layers. Because as we said, this part of self, let's say, cannot be destroyed, cannot be affected, but it can be hidden when we start covering it up with all these different false identities. And almost, you know, get it to a point where it feels very suffocated, and it's difficult to bring it back to life. But also that conversation also made me think how really deep down we are constantly longing for these higher experiences of immortality and timeless. But in this confusion of who we are looking for these soul experiences, if you like, of love and peace in the wrong direction, in the physical, which of course it's almost like we are setting ourselves up for disappointment then, and unhappiness, because we cannot meet these needs, these higher soul experiences, if you like, in the physical dimension.
So yeah, that there was one quote I quite liked. Chigom Chupia said, "Enlightenment is ego's ultimate disappointment," and maybe
Yes.
because that's really not what the ego wants. It wants to keep us looking for like the chase, you know, the excitement, but actually to take a step back and be an observer and come to something higher, the ego is not interested. So it's useful to start to realize that little game inside, but that we do have an option, and that ultimately will give strength to that original self, and we won't go for that lower instinct, the ego, for the quick fix, which is not good for the self, the body, and the environment, or our relationships. So creating that environment to empower ourselves and give us the bigger range of the options that we have.
An ego will try to survive and fight back always. And it's very clever in the way that it finds its way. So even in spirituality, we might have an ego developed if we are not careful. It's gonna fight back.
It's described like a clever monkey. It
Mm-hmm.
will use anything to expand, but if we know beforehand, then it helps. So would you like to maybe take us on a little bit of it? Could be experiential, but what is that easy method or clear path, or what is it that's helped you to come into that true self experience and therefore create the best environment for that higher consciousness?
So I think it's a few key points. One is to do with when we try to understand the true self, in particular within the context of Raj Yoga. Once we grasp, I suppose, who we are on that deeper level, it becomes very obvious that the problem is not the story, if you like. So we don't try to change, which I think it's a lot of what psychology does at the moment, but all of us on individual level does, is to change things in the story. And so what that means in one's life, and or to improve the role, to improve the person, if you like. But if we add this perspective of the true self and the real I, it's so obvious that that's not what the solution is. Actually, all we need to do is we need to change our perspective. And what that means is that we change the way that we relate to this physical world. So when I understand, I suppose, that everything in this dimension is very fragile and it's very fleeting, I'm not going to be interested in developing, let's say, attachments. I'm not going to be interested in trying to find the sense of myself in things in the physical. And so I'm more likely then to relate and to be in this physical world, and operate, but if you like, adopt what we call a detached involvement. So I'm very involved, I participate in the physical and in whatever, my life consists of. But I don't actually get dependent on things. And I think these two things, to be able to see the story as it is and to be able to operate in this world without becoming attached, by having this attitude of a detached observer, is something that can really allow us to step back from these ego identities. And of course, a big tool for everyone on the spiritual path is our meditation, because the aim of our meditation is to bring to light this awareness of the true self, experience it, but also experience the feelings that come with it. And bring it to our, make them strong and bring them to our everyday life. So that can then be reflected in our behavior. So, and there are different ways. I mean, I can go more into examples of how that will look like, but I don't know whether you like to ask me anything at this point.
Yes, it would be nice to hear. Just a thought, this phrase, this too shall pass, is actually in our local hospital in the reception, and it's like a way of managing this drama of life. It's sort of hinting at that observer. When we just see everyday life, it's an experience. It's quite helpful because, ordinarily it can evoke emotions, reactions, some push, pull, but it's an experience. It's a bit like going on a train journey and you go up and you down, or roller coaster. So this experiencer watching and experiences going on, and that freedom, I think that was really nice. It's interesting what you said. In psychology, they're perhaps working with the story. And I think you've said this before, and I think it was a nice to distinguish that psychology and spirituality can't really be compared. They have different aims and they work in different ways. So it's not to say that there isn't very, it's a helpful model, but it's working in a different paradigm or different.
Yeah, psychology looks the content of one's life. And that's very much to do with the human, if you like, side of things. So our relationships, our health, our finances, all of this that consist. And doesn't necessarily, and it feels like sometimes, we help the person because we don't, I suppose, address the problem in its root. It can only have short-term benefits. It doesn't, I suppose, resolve things to their root. That's the limitation, I suppose, of just having this kind of limited perspective in understanding human suffering.
You gave an image once which stuck with me. It's like the therapist or the psychologist can help hold the space to show the incongruences of thought patterns and belief systems which are not connected to the way things are. So it's like bursting the bubble of any confusion and helping to shift or give a new way which is practical. So it's dispelling the myths or our limited thinking. So, but something you said, it's not stopping the bubble machine because this is a result of not seeing the broader map ourselves, which we do tend to have a better view from a third person view, someone else's life. We can kind of see it. So it's almost like helping train our own objective position so we can burst our own bubbles. That I thought was helpful.
Yeah, that's a good image to hold in mind.
And another thing I think that can come is that this space is loving. So that is not that we are, moving away from anyone, but it's from that space of independence. So it won't be with that taking energy. So yeah, be nice to hear any thoughts to deepen and experience those feelings. You mentioned that you had some examples.
So when we when I suppose we have this detached involvement with life, and when we don't try to change the story, we can see how that can have an impact on lots of other things in our lives. And I suppose that's how maybe in spirituality we operate. We come from the inside. We change the perspective, and that is going to be also reflected in our everyday life. And I think a big domain that can be a big source of happiness and unhappiness for people are relationships and our interactions with other people. There's a lot of ego that can be present in our interactions with other people and can cause lots of issues. And we know that there's probably an ego identity, if you like, when there's a lot of irritability that we experience in our relationships with other people, because normally ego likes to be right. So what we find out in relationships then is that either we're not very tolerant of other people's limitations, or we demand other people to constantly understand us, or we get very offended and take things very personally if people don't agree with us. So all these can be reasons for arguments and disagreements, on a small scale to a bigger scale. But this is good indicators that we operate from ego, because there's a lot of fear, if you like, and there is lots of reactivity. When we are bringing that deeper sense of who we are in the way that we interact with other people, there's a different attitude, if you like, that we have. It's more because, again, we feel quite secure. So we are more likely to be more accepting of others, accept them as they are, so without trying to change them. And actually, it doesn't really matter as much what other people think of us. So that need is a lot at the moment that people worry about, social anxiety. We see that. It's unbelievable how many people are socially anxious. But, that sense of constantly thinking what other people think of us, wanting to be liked, because to this deeper sense of who we are, it's irrelevant that, it doesn't need that to feel secure or to feel okay about itself. So we are more likely to be accepting of others. We are more likely to be less reactive to others. And actually, we respond, if we need to respond to somebody, we do it from a place of wisdom rather than a place of fear. So we're going to have better results. So by not reactive and by accepting people, when we have this, connection with our deeper sense, we are more likely to develop more successful relationships. Also, we start connecting with other people, not only on this superficial level or the emotional bond maybe that we have developed, but we have this spiritual bond with others. So when I become aware of my true self, or my real I, or this kind of point of light, I'm more likely to recognize that to others. So, it can be very transformative of relationships, but also it can help me to deal with the ups and downs of life. So, for a start, I don't make unreasonable demands on this life to make me happy. So, but I'm also deal with loss better. I deal with change better. So it's interesting. There's a definition for depression as resistant to change. When I'm aware of my deeper reality and who I am, I can see that alongside with this physical dimension that is, very fleeting, very fragile, and is changing all the time, where things, come to an end and go. I know that there is another reality that is completely unaffected by that, and that really helps me to deal with the ups and downs, because I know that no matter what happens in the physical, that part of my reality cannot be affected. And I think actually it's when I am in this place of feeling secure and the awareness of the true self that I'm willingly can detach. I can't do it any other way, because I think if we do it any other way, it can only lead to depression and to repression. And we see that, people where they decide they're not gonna attach themselves to anything anymore, but it doesn't come from that place. And we have different problems. We have the very socially avoidant people who actually have sat down and stopped engaging with life, but it still comes from from a place of fear of being let down and be hurt. So it doesn't come, from that place of the awareness of the true self.
It's for those on this call, some of you might be hearing for the first time, some maybe practice meditators, but I know for myself, I almost can't hear it enough. It's like always reorientating. And, of course, it's in the context that we've all crossed this line of clarity and are taking from something temporary, but just being reminded that we're more than the sum of these temporary roles, that there is that true self, the actor behind that knows belonging truly, and that peace and connection. And if we tap into that, so what you're saying, the spiritual bond with others that you mentioned is more that we feel it in ourselves, that inherent security, the calmness of mind that gives us clarity and self-respect. We see that others are either expressing their true nature or kind of wanting it, and usually looking for it through others' approval or through securing something in the physical. But if we lift ourselves, we can see they have it, and that's the essence of who they are in their being. It builds a connection with that. And I've certainly found that really helpful, because the tendency to want to fix the drama for the self, but also for others, is very strong. We're social animals, so we don't only identify with our own issues, but others. So there's never happiness. It's the guilt, and you mentioned that earlier too. So it's like I'm not helping anyone by feeling guilty or sad about someone else's. And we see it with bereavement, don't we? I mean, those bereaved, they have to cope with their own emotions, but lots of others too, and it doesn't help them. So how can we need to lift ourselves to, even if it's for 1 minute, but get this reference or reconnection. So that's what, yes. There is a question, I don't know whether you want to share your thoughts. I'm just looking for it now. Desires, are they part, or are they coming from the true self? Or are we aiming to be free from desires? Because some spiritual texts speak of that. They were saying, is it that we first fulfill them and then we can go beyond them?
Well, the soul in its true sense, I suppose, it's always full, so it's never empty. So when I really come to that place of the awareness of the true self, because there is that sense of fullness, there is no desire as such. Desire in terms, we have to be, I suppose, careful there in terms of accomplish myself or to becoming myself, because I'm already am, if you see what I mean. But of course, on this physical level that we are, let's say the game of life, there are things that we need to function. So there might be things that we need to do, not necessarily a desire. I suppose is something that I need to achieve in order to feel good, and I think that's where the problem is. If we are operating from that true self, we want things to happen, but we are not devastating or annoyed when they are not. It's an adding thing to what I already have. It's lovely when it happens. I will try for things, I will put my energy is different because I'm not, if you like, looking for the outcome. I'm more involved with the process because I'm enjoying it, not because I want to get something out of it. So I don't know whether so there are kind of very differences how I approach things in life when I'm operating from the ego or where I'm operating from the true self. The energy is very different. And the place where it comes from is very different.
I hope that helps, and maybe it's something to experiment with and get the feeling of the premise of already being full, and then coming into this drama of life more like a game to play, so that we attempt to play to win, but also we know how to fall, and we know that we win. Sometimes we may lose, but it's a game. But the play brings happiness and enthusiasm, energy, not the desperation, because that's when the game becomes a war, because I think I'm vulnerable. So it's that, at least it's a model, we can say, but we come from a kind of that spiritual original space in this model, and this physical in the world, not of the world, but it's happening and we are players. But that allows us to lift ourselves up and get connected to that fullness. It's nice to hear the thoughts.
Something to add on that also, a very nice thing to hold in mind is this different reality. It's what's my primary and what's my secondary reality. So if that's the game, if you like, of life, no matter what happens in that game, I'm still all right. That primary reality can never be affected by anything that happens in this physical dimension. So that's an enormous sense of power that I can get from that, I suppose, that awareness.
For you, has it been a journey to, did it start as a belief, or are you working with it as a model? Because also it's interesting, having come from that psychology background, it's got its model, then this is slightly, it's like a different way of seeing our physical experience. Did it happen quickly?
Well, I think there's always a sense that there's more to what we can see. So that belief was there, or the seed, if you like, has always been there. So you're more receptive, I suppose, to this kind of ideas. But in terms of how do you put these things into practice and how you develop spiritually, it's a process of, for me personally, becoming, I suppose, aware of situations in the everyday life where ego might take over, and step back from that, maybe you start from a place where initially you become aware of these identities being there, but then as the time goes by, this kind of, if you like, the gap between you reacting to something something happened and you reacting to it, get shorter and shorter. And I suppose that's the aim, isn't it? That and that happens when you come to that place where there is so much awareness of the true self that these identities do not even have space to emerge. So I think that's the practice, and everyday life is full of opportunities. I think for me, sometimes negative feelings is a good indicator for me to stop and understand what's really going on, and bring the bigger picture. I know that this is where I cross the line. You know, I've forgotten about the whole picture, the human being, and it's a combination of having that, strengthening that awareness, bring it to your everyday life. So it's this awareness, it's there all the time. And also, as I said, when, that things are happening and you think that you lose it, be able to bring it back to place early on. So yeah, you constantly shorten that gap. If that makes sense. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it'd be lovely to hear from you in the chat. It makes sense to me. It feels like it's about taking responsibility, in the sense it's very empowering, because the narrative we're given by ego is that it's something, someone else. And, it's so a big impulse, isn't it, to sort of look outside for what made me feel this way. But that is, you mentioned earlier about, it's like the beggar or the victim. So the premise from this is like, we are players, we have an inherent richness, and we can come and we can choose the attitude. That's a big thing. And also, it'd be interesting if you want to say anything more about this observing, and this is so empowering as well. So we need to see, otherwise we might repress, or we might deny, or we might gloss over those reactions. But it's also observing it from strength, isn't it? It's not the analysis. I know myself more used to analyzing, but it can sometimes keep us a bit down, or, we might get kind of a bit overwhelmed. So it's like, I don't know if you have anything to say about the observing, but from the fullness.
Yeah, you need to come to that place of the true self. You need to get that perspective, and I think we use quite a lot of, whoever is familiar a little bit with our meditation, we use quite a lot of concept about being a guest here. So nothing is mine, nobody is mine. So why then, it's just this very, there's so much truth in that, but we actually forget that. So it's bringing that perspective in place, bringing the perspective of a visitor, that I'm here only temporary. So within that context, I will see very differently an argument. I will see very differently something that somebody might said, it's, I suppose, it's not so much, as you said, analyzing. When things happen, it's not so much analyzing things or trying to understand who is right, who is wrong. It's about going back to that sense of who you really are as a soul, that actually, that deeper sense, that and awareness that when it comes to this part, nothing has ever happened to it. I think that's something, a very powerful thing that always helps me. Nothing has ever happened to it, and nothing will ever happen to it, because it's actually cannot be affected. I think this kind of awareness, again, it's the perspective is very different. So the energy you bring to a situation is very different. You can let go. you don't need to complain, you don't need to control, you don't need to change things. You are more in a place of acceptance, being at ease, have realistic expectations, and be involved in life, but by keeping that inner freedom. So the inner life is kind of protected.
Yeah, those things are really worth reflecting on, that nothing has ever happened to this true self. So we do have one more question, and then maybe we'll close as we've come to time. But is it ego if I want someone not to make a mistake, if I see he's going to make one?
So to see something that needs to be corrected, I suppose, again, you need more information, I suppose, to make a decision whether that's ego or not. Ego in general tries to find out what's wrong with other people, strives on that. So I would say one way of positioning oneself right when things like that happen is to be aware of what is the energy by which you're approaching that situation. Is this to point to the other person that is wrong so that you are right? So that's an ego inflation for sure, even if you are. So it's the way you are doing it. And if it's not ego, you can still do that, but you're gonna state, if you like, the facts without adding any drama, without adding anything that will make the other person feel less off. It's always important to ask, what's my drive in that comment? What I'm trying to achieve? And then the second question I need to ask, how will I achieve that? Because if I do it with that energy of putting somebody down and making myself good, so that is, you give it to the ego, even if it's the right thing to say to somebody if they do something wrong. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, we can do the so-called right thing for the wrong reasons. So true. So we've come to time. I don't know if there's anything final you want to share, but when you were saying earlier, it feels like you've mentioned before this helicopter view. So, that's also a nice reference point of just seeing a bit up. But if there's any final thoughts, and then maybe, I don't know, you or I can finish with some meditation. Do you wish? Anything else you wanted to share?
Nothing comes to mind at this point. I think we kind of cover most of the things. It would be nice maybe to move to meditation. I think that's where. So I'm happy to go on with that. Yes.
Would you like to share a few words? Or I can, yeah.
Yes. So just spend the next minutes just to reflect on the real I who is a guest in this body, a guest in this physical world, a guest who enjoys the newness of it all, but knows that doesn't need anything. A guest who involves with everything, but doesn't own anything. So it doesn't feel that can lose anything. It stays light and enjoys the journey, internally free to learn and care without holding on anything unnecessary. Every moment is rich and perfect in its own right. The guest has no expectations or desires. He remains emotionally independent. Om Shanti.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for bridging these fields and sharing your experience. And, you know, it's really our own laboratory, isn't it? It's the psychology as a science. And we are, in this case, that scientist, but using ideas for in the laboratory of the mind, and our experience is the proof and becomes an authority. So we're really all, it's a very exciting time, I think, to come back, taking back that power. So appreciate everyone joining, and we'll stay connected. I want to just give this opportunity to share something coming up from the Inner Space team. We have a retreat over Christmas, and these ideas, of which Konstantina touched on, are going to be explored over 7 days, and we'll type the link and further information in the chat. So also this was recorded today, and there will be opportunity to watch again on the Cambridge Inner Space channel. So we'll look forward to future events, and this staying with this simplicity and easiness of this primary and secondary world, and nothing has ever happened to the experiencer that still point, that truly peaceful being. So taking that to the rest of the evening. Thanks to everyone, and we'll see you again next time.